The throne room was the size of a small moon. That was not an exaggeration. Marcus Cole had pulled up the structural scans on his salvage scanner when the tractor beam first seized his ship, and the numbers had come back 3 times before he accepted them. The interior chamber of the Dragon Emperor's throne world, a planet carved hollow from the inside, layer upon layer of ancient stone and burning gold light, measured 4.2 kilometers from floor to ceiling. The columns holding up that ceiling were wider than city blocks. The carvings etched into those columns told histories that predated human civilization by a comfortable margin. And at the far end of this impossible room, seated on a throne built from the fused bones of 100 conquered warships, was the most powerful being Marcus had ever seen in person. He didn't look powerful right now. Emperor Vaelthrox. For 1,000 years old, sovereign of 27 civilizations, the living flame around which an entire galaxy's worth of political agreements orbited like nervous moons, was the color of old ash. His scales, which Marcus had seen in propaganda imagery burning like molten copper, now held the dull gray of a fire that had run out of things to consume. His chest rose and fell in slow, labored rhythms. His eyes, when they opened at all, carried the distant expression of someone who had already started saying goodbye to things. Marcus had seen that expression before. He'd seen it on soldiers in the field, always right before he refused to let them die. He was thinking about that when the Kreth ambassador finished speaking. The Kreth were ancient beings, slow, stone gray, roughly humanoid if you were being generous, and possessed of a philosophical tradition that spanned 11 millennia. They did not rush. They did not emote. They processed the universe like a glacier processes a mountain, with total patience and absolute certainty that the end result was inevitable. The ambassador had been speaking for 6 minutes in a voice like grinding bedrock, and the summary of his 11 millennia of philosophical wisdom, delivered in front of 27 alien delegations and the dying emperor himself, was essentially this. Some things end. This is one of them. Let it. The Veari delegation bowed their luminous heads in respectful agreement. The Solken Collective's hive mind representative went still in a particular way that meant consensus had been reached. The Dragon High Council, arranged in a ceremonial crescent behind the throne, exchanged grave looks that managed to communicate both sorrow and the quiet relief of people who had run out of ideas and were glad someone finally said so out loud. Marcus laughed. It wasn't a polite sound. It wasn't quiet or brief or easy to ignore. It came out in the way laughter always did when something scared him badly enough. Sudden, sharp, and completely uninterested in the opinions of the room. It bounced off 4.2 kilometers of ancient stone and came back from 17 different directions, filling the most sacred diplomatic chamber in the known galaxy with the sound of one human being finding something genuinely, darkly funny. The silence that followed was the loudest silence Marcus had ever been inside. He became aware, in the specific way that a person becomes aware of a thing, when approximately 200 alien dignitaries turned to look at them simultaneously, that he had made some kind of mistake. The Veari ambassador, 7 feet of bioluminescent grace wrapped in ceremonial silver, turned toward him with an expression that managed to convey both divine offense and a sincere question about whether humans were, in fact, capable of basic cognition. The Dragon High Council had gone from grave to volcanic in the span of a breath. 3 of the guard dragons near the throne entrance had lowered their heads in the specific way that Marcus had learned in the 30 seconds since his ship was seized, meant they were deciding whether to incinerate something. None of that was what stopped the laughter. What stopped it was the Emperor, Vaelthrox, who had not moved with any real purpose in the 3 hours Marcus had been standing in this room, who had barely acknowledged the Veari's 40 days of ritual or the Soken 6 billion diagnostic simulations or the Kretha's grand philosophical conclusion, turned his head, slowly, toward the back of the room, toward the one figure who wasn't supposed to be there. His eyes opened, not halfway, fully. They were the color of deep copper, and even faded and exhausted as he was, there was something behind them that was not ready to go dark yet. Something old and tired and still, underneath all of it, alive. It fixed on Marcus with the focus of a being who had spent 4,000 years learning to recognize things that mattered. The throne room held its breath. Marcus Cole, former field medic, current unlicensed salvage contractor, man who had been in the wrong sector of space at the wrong moment and found himself tractor-beamed into galactic history, stood in the back of the most important room in the known galaxy, wearing a jacket with a burn mark on the left sleeve, and looked back at the emperor without flinching. His laugh had faded, but the reason for it hadn't. He'd laughed because he knew that expression on the emperor's face. He'd carried men wearing that expression off battlefields that everyone else had already called lost. He'd had commanders tell him those men were already gone, already written off, already dead in every way that mattered. He'd never once believed them, and he wasn't starting now. The Veari ambassador's voice came out like a blade wrapped in silk. Remove the human. The emperor's voice, when it came, was barely above a whisper, but it filled every centimeter of that 4-kilometer room. No. The word landed like a stone dropped into still water. No. One syllable, barely voiced, and yet it moved through the throne room like a pressure wave, like something physical that pushed against chests and forced shoulders back. The Veari ambassador actually stepped backward, one small, involuntary step that she would probably spend the rest of her diplomatic career pretending had not happened. The Dragon High Council exchanged looks that had shifted from volcanic to something more complicated, confused, uncertain, the kind of look powerful beings where when the rules they built their entire understanding around suddenly don't apply anymore. Emperor Vael'Thrax had not overruled his council in 11 years. Not once. Not on military matters. Not on trade agreements. Not on the slow ceremonial decisions that kept the Dominion's 27 civilizations from remembering all the reasons they used to hate each other. He had been, in those 11 years, a figurehead, present, symbolic, revered, and increasingly distant. The High Council had grown quietly accustomed to governing in the space his silence created. He was not silent now. His eyes had not moved from Marcus. That copper gaze, exhausted and faded as it was, held a quality that Marcus recognized from a different kind of experience. The look of someone who had just heard something real in a room full of performance. The look of a man in a hospital bed who'd been receiving visits all day from people saying the right things, and had finally heard someone say something true. Bring him forward, the emperor said. The guard dragons near the entrance did not move immediately. One of them, massive, dark-scaled, with a scar running from his left eye to the base of his jaw, looked toward Commander Rel, the emperor's guard captain, who stood at rigid attention beside the throne's lower step. Rel's expression gave nothing away. After a moment that felt considerably longer than it was, he gave a single, small nod. The guards parted. Marcus walked forward. He was aware of every eye in the room tracking him. 200 alien dignitaries. The full Dragon High Council. Guard units positioned at intervals he'd already unconsciously mapped out of professional habit. He walked the way he always walked into situations that could kill him, steadily, without rushing, giving nothing away. His boots made sounds on the ancient stone floor that were embarrassingly ordinary in the context of the room. He stopped 10 feet from the base of the throne and looked up. Up close, the emperor was both more and less than propaganda images. More because no image had captured the sheer scale of him. Even seated, even diminished, Vael'Thrax was enormous in a way that geological features were enormous. The kind of size that the human brain processed not as a measurement but as a category. Less because up close, the gray in his scales was worse. The light that should have lived in them was almost gone. His breathing was audible from here. Slow, careful, like a man carrying something fragile across uneven ground. Marcus didn't bow. Not because he was making a point. It simply didn't occur to him. You laugh, the emperor said. His voice was stronger in proximity. Still rough, still labored, but with a texture underneath it. Something that had once been extraordinary and wasn't entirely gone yet. Yeah, Marcus said. Why? Around them, the silence had taken on a new quality. Not the held-breath silence of shock anymore. Something more attentive. The Veari ambassador had composed herself and was watching with the careful stillness of someone who had decided to gather information before deciding how offended to be. Several council members had leaned forward almost imperceptibly. Marcus considered the question honestly, the way he considered all questions that actually mattered. Because a rock being up there just told the most powerful creature in the known galaxy to lie down and die, he said, and everyone in this room nodded along like that was wisdom. And I've heard that speech before. Different words. Same speech. And the people who gave it were always wrong. A murmur moved through the delegations. The Kreth ambassador's expression, which had roughly the emotional range of a cliff face, managed to convey something in the neighborhood of displeasure. The emperor was quiet for a moment. They were not wrong about my condition. I didn't say they were wrong about your condition. I said they were wrong about what it means. Marcus glanced briefly at the assembled dignitaries, then back. Can I ask you something? A pause. Then, with something that might have been curiosity beneath the exhaustion, You're asking permission? From you, yeah. Another pause. Longer this time. Ask. When did you stop wanting to fight it? The throne room went very still. It was not the question anyone had expected. The Solken representative's hive mind flickered. A brief, visible disruption in their collective processing. Commander Rel's carefully neutral expression shifted for just a moment into something that looked almost like recognition. The Veari ambassador's head tilted a precise 3 degrees to the left. The emperor said nothing for long enough that Marcus began to wonder if he'd miscalculated. It happened. Not often, but it happened. Then Velthorox closed his eyes. When he opened them again, something had changed in them. Not recovered, not yet, maybe not for a long time, but present, more present than they'd been. Sit down, human, he said quietly. Marcus looked around. There was nothing to sit on in the immediate vicinity except 4,000 years of imperial stone flooring. He sat on that, cross-legged, and pulled a ration bar from his jacket pocket. He broke it in half out of habit, looked up, and held one half toward the emperor. Somewhere behind him, a council member made a sound of pure strangled outrage. The emperor looked at the offered ration bar for a long moment. Then, for the first time in longer than any record in the Dominion's archives to confirm, Emperor Velthorox made a sound that was not quite a laugh, but was the shape of one, like a space where a laugh had recently been and might be again. Tell me, he said, what you think you know. Marcus settled in. Tell me when the light started going out. And so, in the most sacred diplomatic chamber in the known galaxy, while 27 civilizations watched in stunned silence, a dying emperor and an unlicensed salvage contractor began to talk. Not in ceremony, not in protocol, like two people who had both been written off before, and knew exactly what that felt like. The emperor talked for a long time, not in the way emperors talked in formal settings, measured, deliberate, every word chosen for its political weight and ceremonial precision. He talked the way someone talks when they've been holding something for so long that the holding itself has become exhausting, and the presence of one person who isn't performing attention finally makes it possible to stop, halting at first, then steadier. The words came out rough and unpolished, and completely unlike anything the Dragon High Council had ever heard from their sovereign, and Marcus listened the way he had learned to listen in field hospitals, without interrupting, without rushing toward conclusions, without the particular cruelty of people who listen only long enough to find an opening for their own response. The graying had begun. Velthorox said, approximately 60 years ago. Not as pain, not as crisis, as distance. A slow withdrawal of warmth from his own chest, like a fire settling into itself on a cold night. Something you barely notice until you realize the room is darker than it was an hour ago. The court physicians had run diagnostics. The Solken Collective had been consulted twice in that first decade, their hive mind cycling through 17,000 diagnostic frameworks and returning results that all said variations of the same thing. Age-related decline in life flame intensity, consistent with expected patterns in dragon physiology beyond the 4 millennium threshold. Essentially, he was old. Old things wound down. This was natural. He had believed them. What reason was there not to? And the council? Marcus asked. A pause. The council was informed. They were reassuring. I bet they were, Marcus said. The emperor looked at him with something sharp behind the exhaustion. You find that suspicious. I find everything suspicious. It's a personality flaw. Marcus turned the second half of his ration bar over in his fingers. What happened 200 years ago? You said something earlier. You stopped laughing 200 years ago. That's a specific number. The copper eyes went distant. Her name was Thesseril, my youngest. She died in the Kethrin border conflict, a war I had spent 40 years preventing, a silence that had real weight in it. After that, I withdrew from certain things. The council took on more responsibilities. It seemed reasonable at the time. And nobody pushed back. They are a council. They serve at my pleasure. Right. Marcus was quiet for a moment. So for 200 years, you've been grieving alone, surrounded by people whose jobs depend on you not asking them hard questions, and slowly getting sicker in a way that everyone kept telling you was normal. He paused, and it never occurred to anyone to ask whether you want to get better. The silence that followed was long enough to be uncomfortable and honest enough to mean something. The Ve'ari performed their rituals, Vael'Tharax said. There was a faint offensiveness in it. Not himself, but the effort that had been made. He was not a being who dismissed effort easily. The Ve'ari performed their rituals for an illness they were told about and never questioned. Marcus said, the Solken ran simulations on data that was handed to them. Nobody in this room, no offense to the rocks, actually sat down and asked you what was happening inside. He glanced briefly at the assembled delegations, who had maintained their stunned silence with impressive collective discipline. I'm guessing that's not unusual. I am the Emperor. Yeah, that's the problem. Another sharp look, but this one had something else in it. Something that in a human face Marcus would have called recognition. He pressed forward carefully. I've worked trauma cases. Not the physical kind. Well, those too, but not only those. People who stop healing not because their body can't, but because some part of them stopped asking it to. The body follows the will a lot further than most medical textbooks want to admit. He met the Emperor's gaze directly. When did you stop asking? Vael'Tharax did not answer immediately. When he did, the words came out with a particular kind of weight. Not dramatic, just true. I am not certain I remember. Marcus nodded slowly. He'd expected that. It was always the answer in one form or another. He was about to speak again when something caught his attention. It was small, easy to miss, a flicker in his peripheral vision. Not movement exactly, but the cessation of movement. One of the Ve'ari diplomatic aides, positioned near the left colonnade, had gone very still in a way that was different from the general stillness of the room. The specific stillness of someone who has just heard something they didn't want heard. Marcus filed it away without showing that he'd noticed. Another personality trait. The habit of seeing things and waiting to understand what they meant before reacting. It had kept him alive in worse rooms than this one. He refocused on the Emperor. I want to look at the original diagnostic data. Everything the Solken ran. Everything the court physicians logged in the first decade. You are a salvage contractor. I'm a field medic who became a salvage contractor. There's a difference. He paused. A big one in this particular situation. Commander Rel, who had not spoken since Marcus was brought forward, moved for the first time. He stepped down from the throne's lower platform and approached, not aggressively, but with the deliberate precision of a being who did everything with intention. Up close, he was extraordinary, dark-scaled, battle-scarred, with eyes that processed Marcus the way a locked door processes a key, trying to determine whether the specific shape belonged. The archive access you're requesting, Rel said quietly, is restricted to High Council members and Imperial physicians. Then I'll need the Emperor to authorize it. Rel looked up at Vael'Tharax. The Emperor held his gaze for a moment, then gave a single, slow nod. Rel looked back at Marcus with an expression that was not quite respect and not quite suspicion, and lived in the complicated territory between them. I'll arrange it, he said. Marcus stood, brushing stone dust from his jacket. He had approximately 72 hours before the council's patience expired and the execution debate resumed in earnest. He had no medical equipment beyond a standard field kit. He had no political standing, no allies, and no particular reason, by any measurable standard, to believe he could succeed where 27 civilizations had failed. He had a hunch, a dead emperor's daughter, 200 years of unprocessed grief, and a flicker of stillness near the left colonnade that didn't add up. It wasn't much. He'd worked with less. He was halfway across the throne room floor when he stopped and turned back. The Emperor was watching him, that copper gaze following him across the stone with something in it that hadn't been there an hour ago. Something provisional and fragile and real. One more thing, Marcus said. When I come back, and I will come back, I'm going to need you to be honest with me. Not Emperor honest. Actually honest. A pause that stretched long enough to matter. And if I find that difficult? Vael'Tharax asked. Then we're going to have the same conversation until you don't. Marcus turned back toward the archive corridor. I've got time. Apparently, so do you. Behind him, he heard it again, that sound from the Emperor. Not quite a laugh. The shape of one. The space where one had been for 200 years. Slowly, carefully, beginning to remember its own outline. He didn't smile until he was out of sight of the room. Then he let himself briefly, because what he'd seen in that diagnostic summary rel had handed him as he passed a single page, standard medical shorthand. 60 years of log data had shown him something that had nothing to do with age-related decline. Something in those numbers had been changed, not degraded by time, not corrupted by system error, edited. The Imperial Archive was older than most governments. Marcus stood in the center of it and tried not to let that fact distract him, which was harder than it should have been. The room was circular, carved from a single piece of black stone that had been polished to a mirror finish over centuries of use. The records themselves existed in layers, the oldest in physical form, etched into copper plates stacked in climate-controlled alcoves that lined the walls from floor to ceiling, the more recent in crystalline data storage that caught the room's low amber light and threw it back in fractured patterns across the floor. A dragon archivist sat at a desk near the entrance, watching Marcus with the particular expression of someone who deeply resents a situation they cannot change. Marcus ignored him and got to work. He had the page Rel handed him spread on the reading table in front of him, and he'd requested physical pull of every diagnostic log from the first 12 years of the Grang's recorded history. They arrived in 7 copperplate bundles, each one requiring a separate authorization code that Rel had provided without comment. Marcus worked through them methodically, the way he'd been taught to work a casualty scene. Start at the beginning. Assume nothing. Let the evidence build its own picture before you decide what you're looking at. The first 3 bundles were consistent. Standard Imperial physician logs, detailed and precise, documenting the gradual reduction in the Emperor's life flame intensity across yearly examination cycles. The language was careful and clinical and thoroughly unsurprising. The court physicians had noted the decline, cross-referenced it against historical records of elder dragon physiology, and concluded consistently across multiple practitioners over 11 years that the pattern was consistent with natural age-related diminishment. It was the 4th bundle where the picture changed, not dramatically. That was the thing about it. Whoever had done this was not careless or rushed. The alterations were subtle enough that Marcus almost missed them twice, and he was specifically looking for them. Certain baseline readings from years 3 and 4 of the recorded decline had been adjusted, not dramatically, but directionally. Numbers shifted just enough to move the diagnostic picture from unusual to expected. A specific enzyme marker that appeared in years 2 through 5, something Marcus didn't have a name for in dragon physiology, but recognized by its structural pattern as an external biological agent, appeared in the raw data and was absent from the summary reports. Someone had scrubbed it, not deleted. That would have left gaps that even a basic integrity check would flag. They had replaced it, substituted a naturally occurring compound with a similar molecular signature, close enough to pass a routine review, different enough that Marcus could see the seam if he was looking at the right angle in the right light. He sat back and stared at the ceiling for a moment. 60 years. Someone had been running this for 60 years. That wasn't a crime of opportunity or a political gamble taken in a moment of desperation. That was a commitment. That was the kind of patience that required absolute certainty in the goal, total confidence in the method, and the particular coldness of someone who had decided that the end result was worth whatever the process cost. The question was not whether someone was poisoning the Emperor. Marcus was now certain they were. The question was how, and from where and by whom, and whether they knew he was pulling archive records at this particular moment. He thought about the stillness near the left colonnade, the diplomatic aide who had gone quiet at exactly the wrong moment. He thought about access. Whoever altered these records had done so from inside the Imperial medical system, which meant High Council authorization, or Imperial physician credentials. The circle was not large. It was, in fact, uncomfortably small. He bundled the relevant plates carefully, noting the specific records he needed copied, and walked back to the archive desk. The dragon archivist looked up with the expression of someone who had been hoping Marcus would leave without making requests. I need copies of bundles 4 through 6, Marcus said. Specifically the raw data columns, not the summary reports. Raw data access requires a secondary authorization from. I have the Emperor's standing authorization. Rel provided the codes. Marcus set the authorization document on the desk. I also need the access log for these records. Every entry, every person who pulled or modified these files in the last 70 years. The archivist stared at him. That is an unusual request. I'm an unusual situation. Marcus held eye contact without aggression. Just steady, patient, completely immovable. The codes are valid. The authorization is real. I'd like the copies and the log, please. The archivist pulled the log. Marcus read it twice. The first time to understand what it said. The second time to understand what it meant. There were 11 access entries over the relevant period. 7 were imperial physicians conducting routine reviews. Expected, log, unremarkable. 3 were High Council administrative entries. Also expected, slightly less unremarkable. The 11th entry was different. It was logged under physician's credentials, time-stamped during a routine review period, and would have been completely invisible against the background of the other entries, except the physician whose credentials were used had died 43 years ago. Someone had kept a dead man's access codes active for 4 decades and used them to quietly, surgically, repeatedly adjust a record of an emperor's illness. Marcus folded the log carefully and put it in his jacket pocket. He walked out of the archive and into the corridor, where Rel was waiting with the specific stillness of a being who had been standing in one place for a long time and had opinions about it. Find what you were looking for? Rel asked. Found more than I was looking for, Marcus said. He kept walking. Rel fell into step beside him, not escorting, exactly, accompanying. There was a difference, and Rel was precise about such things. I need to ask you something, and I need you to answer without telling anyone I asked. Rel was quiet for 3 steps. That depends on the question. Fair enough. Marcus stopped and turned to face him. How long has Dreven been First Council? The question landed in the corridor and sat there. Rel's expression did not change. That was, Marcus had come to understand in their brief acquaintance. Significant. Rel's face changed when things were routine. When things were complicated, it went still. It was very still right now. 812 years, Rel said. And in that time, has he ever disagreed with the Emperor? Publicly, formally on record? A pause. First Councils do not publicly disagree with. That's not what I asked. Another pause. Longer. Once, Rel said carefully. 40 years ago. Regarding the Kethrin border policy. He stopped. Something moved behind his eyes. A connection being made that he wasn't certain he wanted to make. The Emperor chose diplomacy. Dreven argued for military resolution. And 40 years later, the Emperor's daughter died in the Kethrin border conflict. The corridor was very quiet. I'm not saying anything yet, Marcus said. I don't have enough to say anything yet, but I need you to do something for me without logging it, without reporting it, and without discussing it with anyone on the High Council. He met Rel's gaze directly. Can you do that? Rel looked at him for a long moment. The assessment in that look was thorough and unhurried, and reminded Marcus uncomfortably of the kind of evaluation that preceded either trust or violence. What do you need? Rel said finally. Marcus reached into his jacket and pulled out the access log. I need you to find out who has been maintaining a dead physician's credentials in the Imperial medical system for the last 43 years, he said, quietly, without using any system that the High Council has administrative access to. Rel took the log. He looked at it. He looked at Marcus. And while you do that, Marcus continued, I need to go back to the Emperor because of poison in his system. And it is a poison, I'll explain the details later, has a secondary component I haven't identified yet. And the only person who can help me understand what it's doing to him is him. He turned back toward the throne room. Cole, Rel said. Marcus stopped. If you are wrong about this, Rel said quietly, the political consequences will be significant. I know. And if you are right? Marcus was quiet for a moment. He thought about 60 years of patience. A dead physician's credentials. A border war that cost an emperor his daughter and a council's argument. 200 years of a dragon slowly, quietly, being guided toward a death that everyone around him had been carefully taught to call inevitable. If I'm right, Marcus said, then someone in this building has been murdering the emperor in slow motion for 6 decades and calling it natural causes. He started walking again. So let's find out which one it is. Behind him, Rel stood in the corridor with the access log in his hand and an expression that had moved well past complicated into something that had no name in dragon ceremonial vocabulary. He looked like a soldier who had just been handed a map and realized the war had been going on much longer than anyone told him. The throne room was quieter when Marcus returned. The full diplomatic assembly had been dismissed to their quarters for the evening cycle. Whatever passed for evening on a planet carved hollow from the inside, where the light was controlled by ancient systems that nobody fully understood anymore and nobody had needed to fully understand in several thousand years. A skeleton presence remained. For guard dragons at the entrance, 2 council members seated at the far ceremonial table in low conversation that stopped when Marcus entered, and the emperor himself, still on his throne, still breathing in those careful measured rhythms that Marcus had learned to monitor without appearing to monitor them. Vael'Throx watched him cross the floor. You found something. I found several things, Marcus said. I'm going to tell you some of them now and some of them later, and I need you to trust that the order matters. A pause. You are asking an emperor to accept incomplete information on a schedule set by a salvage contractor. I'm asking a patient to let his medic work the problem in the right sequence. Marcus stopped at the base of the throne and looked up. Those are different requests. The second one is reasonable. Something moved in the copper eyes, not quite amusement, but the territory adjacent to it. Proceed. Marcus sat down on the stone floor again. The council members at the far table exchanged a look that contained an entire conversation about protocol, dignity, and the increasingly bewildering situation their empire had found itself in. Marcus paid them no attention. The graying isn't natural, he said. I want you to hear that clearly before anything else. This is not what old age looks like in your species. This is what a very patient, very careful, very deliberate intervention looks like when it's been designed to resemble old age. He watched the emperor's face as he said it, watched for denial, for anger, for particular resistance that people show when a truth arrived that reorganized too many things at once. He saw none of those. He saw something quieter and, in its own way, more painful. The expression of a being who had suspected something for a long time and had not allowed themselves to fully think it. You knew something was wrong, Marcus said. It wasn't a question. I knew something felt wrong. Vael'Throx said carefully. That is different. I have no evidence. I had no framework to. He stopped, steadied, when he spoke again. The words were precise and deliberate, the voice of someone who had spent 4,000 years learning to say difficult things without losing composure. I did not allow myself to pursue the feeling, because the people around you kept telling you it was grief. Yes, and grief felt true enough that you accepted it. A long silence. Thesseral's death was real. The grief was real. It is... He paused again. It is difficult to separate a real wound from one that is being deliberately deepened. Marcus nodded. He understood that better than the emperor probably expected him to. I know, he said simply, and the simplicity of it, no elaboration, no pivot into clinical distance, made the emperor look at him with a new quality of attention. You have experienced this, Vael'Throx said. Different scale, same mechanism. Marcus turned the ration bar wrapper over in his hands, a nervous habit he'd never fully broken. When I was discharged, the official reason was insubordination, unauthorized decision-making. I stayed behind enemy lines to pull out soldiers that command had already classified as unrecoverable. He paused. The unofficial reason, the one that lived in my head for about 3 years afterward, was that I was wrong, that I'd misjudged the situation, that the people with more information and more authority than me had made the correct call, and I'd been too stubborn and too arrogant to accept it. He looked up at the emperor. It took me a long time to understand that those two things, the official story and the doubt it planted, were doing the same work, keeping me small, keeping me from asking questions that would have been inconvenient for someone else. The throne room was very still. Veilthorax regarded him with an expression that 4,000 years of imperial portraiture had never captured and probably never could, because it was not an emperor's expression. It was the expression of a person, old and tired and stripped of ceremony, recognizing something true in another person's words and feeling a particular ache of truths that arrived too late and exactly on time simultaneously. "Who did this to you?" the emperor asked. Not about Marcus, about himself. The question finally asked out loud after, Marcus was now fairly certain, 60 years of being carefully steered away from it. "I don't have a name yet," Marcus said. "I have a direction. I have evidence. And I have about 40 hours before your council loses patience with me and the execution debate starts back up." He met the emperor's gaze. "Which means I need something from you that none of the other delegations thought to ask for." "What do you need?" "I need you to remember," Marcus said. "Not officially, not formally. I need you to go back, as far back as when you first noticed the distance, the coldness in your chest. And I need you to tell me everything that changed around that time. People, policies, decisions that felt slightly off but had reasonable explanations. Moments where you almost asked a question and then didn't." He paused. "The poison in your system has a biological component. I can work on that separately. But there's a second component that's psychological and has been fed by information, specifically by the carefully managed absence of certain kind of information and the careful presence of others." He looked up steadily. "Someone has been curating your reality for a very long time. I need you to help me find the edges of it." For a long moment, the emperor said nothing. The two council members at the far table had gone completely still, not subtly this time, openly. They were listening with the focused intensity of people who understood that the conversation happening 30 meters away was the most important one occurring in their empire and possibly their lifetime. Veilthorax began to speak. He spoke for a long time, longer than before. This was different from the earlier conversation, less about grief, more about specifics. Marcus listened with one part of his attention and tracked with another, building a timeline in his head, mapping events against the archive data he'd already pulled, watching for the places where the emperor's memory of events matched the official record and the places where they didn't quite align. Those misalignments were small. They were always small. That was the craft of it. The thing Marcus was increasingly certain required not just intelligence, but profound and intimate knowledge of the emperor's psychology, the kind of knowledge that only came from centuries of proximity. 3 separate times, the emperor described a moment where he had almost convened an independent medical review outside the normal court physician structure. 3 separate times, something had intervened, once a border crisis that demanded immediate attention, once a dominion-wide ceremonial period that made the timing politically sensitive, once a recommendation from his first council that the disruption to court routine might damage diplomatic relationships at a critical juncture. Marcus did not write any of this down. He didn't have anything to write it on, and he didn't want a physical record sitting in a room with 2 council members whose loyalties he hadn't established. He filed it all carefully in the part of his mind he'd trained for exactly this purpose, the same mental architecture that let a field medic track 12 patients simultaneously in a combat zone, maintaining a complete and current picture of every variable without external aids. By the time the emperor finished, Marcus had what he needed. Not proof, not yet, but a shape, a clear, coherent shape of a plan that spanned decades, operated through institutional systems, and had been implemented with the patient precision of someone who thought in centuries rather than years. Someone for whom 60 years was not a long time. Someone who had been close enough, for long enough, to know exactly which levers to pull and which questions to quietly prevent from being asked. The biological component of the poison Marcus could address. He'd already identified the base compound from the raw diagnostic data, a slow-acting agent that suppressed the biological processes underlying dragon life flame generation. It had a treatment pathway. Not simple, not fast, but real. He could work on that. The psychological component. The 200 years of managed grief, the carefully cultivated sense of inevitability, the slow erosion of the emperor's would have questioned his own decline. That was what he'd been working on for the last several hours. And it was working. He could see it working. The copper in Veilthorax's eyes was marginally brighter than it had been this morning. His breathing was slightly less labored. These were small changes. They were real changes. The third component was the one Marcus hadn't mentioned yet, the contingency. Because whoever had built this plan over 60 years had not built it without accounting for the possibility of discovery. People who thought in centuries planned for interference. They built redundancies. They prepared exits. And Marcus, who had spent 3 years salvaging derelict ships and learning to read the logic of systems built by minds very different from his own, had a strong instinct about what a 60-year redundancy looked like when it activated. He stood up from the stone floor, brushing dust from his jacket with the automatic gesture that was starting to feel like punctuation, the physical equivalent of closing a bracket. "I'm going to need access to your personal physician," he said. "The current one, not the archive records. And I need it framed as a routine consultation. Nothing flagged in the official log." "That can be arranged," the Emperor said. He paused. "Cole." Marcus stopped. The Emperor almost never used his name. When he did, it landed differently, not as a form of address, but as a choice. A deliberate act of acknowledgement. "The things I told you," Vailthrox said carefully, "about Thesseril, about the years after. These are not things I have spoken of to anyone in this court." "I know," Marcus said. "You have not treated them as weapons. They're not mine to use as weapons." He met the Emperor's gaze. "They're yours. I'm just helping you pick them back up." The Emperor was quiet for a moment that carried real weight in it. The weight of 4,000 years of isolation and ceremony, in particular loneliness of power, briefly and genuinely acknowledged. "I chose correctly," Vailthrox said quietly, "in keeping you here." Marcus almost said something deflecting, and then didn't. "Yeah," he said instead, simply, "you did." He turned and walked toward the side corridor that led to physicians' quarters, and he thought about contingencies and redundancies and the specific kind of danger that arrived not with noise and aggression, but with patience and a perfect understanding of the people it intended to destroy. He thought about Dreven, 800 years of service, one lost argument, 60 years of silence on the subject of that loss. And he thought about the Veari diplomatic aid near the left colonnade. And he thought about a dead physician's credentials kept active for 4 decades. And he thought about the 3 moments when an independent medical review had almost happened and somehow hadn't. He thought about the secondary contingency he was now nearly certain existed. And he moved faster. The physician's name was Cereval. She was young by dragon standards, barely 3 centuries old, with scales the color of dark bronze and the precise, economical movements of someone who had trained for a long time in environments where carelessness had consequences. She met Marcus in her quarters off the eastern corridor with the expression of a professional who had been told to cooperate with someone she didn't understand and had decided to do so competently rather than graciously. Marcus respected that. Graciousness without competence was the most dangerous thing in any medical setting. He explained what he needed without preamble. She listened without interrupting. When he finished, she was quiet for exactly 4 seconds, long enough to be genuine, short enough to be useful. And then she pulled her diagnostic equipment from its storage alcove and began setting it up with the focused efficiency of someone who had just been handed a problem worth solving. "The compound you identified from the archive data," she said, not looking up from her calibrations. "I've seen anomalous readings consistent with its presence 3 times in the last decade. I flagged them each time." She paused. The flags were reviewed by the senior court physician and cleared as instrument variants. Who was the senior court physician during those reviews? She looked up. Different physicians each time. The senior position rotates on a 12-year cycle. Another pause. But the administrative review, the formal clearance that closed each flag, came from the same office every time. She held his gaze steadily. First Counsel's Administrative Division. Routine medical oversight. Standard protocol. Marcus said nothing. He didn't need to. The shape he'd been building in his head acquired another edge, another defined line. And the picture it was forming was clear enough now that he could see it whole, not just a mechanism, but the mind behind it. The particular architecture of a plan built by someone who understood institutions from the inside, who knew that the most effective place to hide interference was inside the normal flow of administrative process, where nobody looked because everybody assumed somebody else already had. Cereval ran the diagnostic in silence. Marcus watched the readings and translated them against his field medic's knowledge of biological suppression agents. A different species, a different compound, but the underlying logic was universal. Something in the Emperor's system was interrupting the biological process that generated and sustained his life flame, not destroying it directly. That would have been detectable, traceable, a clear act of aggression. Instead, suppressing the regenerative cycle, slowing the flame's ability to replenish itself after the normal expenditure of daily function. Over 60 years, the cumulative effect was identical to extreme age-related decline. Over 60 years, it was also potentially irreversible if allowed to continue much longer. How long? Marcus asked. Cerebral understood the question without needing it expanded. At the current rate of suppression, complete life flame extinction in approximately 14 months. She looked at the readings with an expression that was professionally controlled and personally devastated. If we begin countertreatment immediately, if the compound I think you've identified is correct, we can interrupt the suppression cycle. The regenerative process should resume within weeks. She paused. Should. What's the variable? The psychological component you described. She met his eyes directly. Life flame generation in dragons is not purely biological. The will to sustain it, the active, conscious engagement with continued existence, is a genuine physiological factor, not metaphorical, not ceremonial, measurable. She pulled up a secondary reading and showed it to him. Look at this baseline from this morning versus the baseline from 3 days ago, before you arrived. Marcus looked. The difference was small. It was unambiguous. He's already responding. Cerebral said quietly, whatever you've been doing in that throne room, it's working on the biological level. The regenerative cycle is showing the earliest indicators of reinitiation. She lowered the scanner. I don't have a medical framework for what you did, but it's working. Marcus filed that away and moved forward. I need you to begin the countertreatment tonight. Quietly, log as a routine supplemental therapy, something that won't flag in the standard review system. That requires falsifying a medical log. It requires protecting a patient from whoever has been accessing his medical logs for 60 years through a dead physician's credentials. He held her gaze. Your call, but make it fast. She made it in about 2 seconds. I'll need 2 hours to prepare the initial treatment compound. She turned back to her equipment. Come back at the 3rd evening bell. Use the eastern entrance. It bypasses the main corridor monitoring. Marcus turned to leave. Cole, she said. He stopped. It was becoming a pattern. People stopping him with his name right as he reached the door, as though the most important things always waited until the last possible moment to be said. The senior physician who cleared my flags, Cerebral said. She was not looking at him. Her hands were moving over her equipment with careful precision, and her voice was level in a way that voices went level when they were carrying something heavy. He retired 8 months ago. Unexpectedly. He told me it was health concerns. She paused. He was the healthiest dragon I knew. Marcus stood in the doorway for a moment. Where is he now? His retirement residence is in the outer residential tier, eastern quadrant. Another pause. He stopped responding to communications 4 months ago. Marcus left without answering, because there was nothing to say that was more useful than moving quickly. And he was already moving. He found Rel in the secondary guard station off the main corridor, a small, functional room that smelled of weapon oil and old stone, where the guard captain conducted the administrative work of Imperial security with the same precise economy he applied to everything else. Rel looked up when Marcus entered and read his expression with the speed of someone who had spent 8 centuries learning to assess situations through faces. You have something, Rel said. I have most of it. Marcus sat down across from him. The access log. What did you find? Rel placed a single document on the table between them. The credentials belonging to Physician Carath, deceased 43 years ago, were maintained to a standing administrative authorization originating in the First Council's office. The authorization was filed as a routine archival access preservation order, standard procedure for records continuity. He paused. It would have required personal sign-off from the First Council himself to initiate. Dreven signed off on keeping a dead man's credentials active. 8 months after Caratha's death. The timing is within normal administrative windows. It would not have attracted attention. Rel's voice was completely controlled. His hands, flat on the table, were very still. I also ran a secondary check. The 3 independent medical reviews that were proposed and subsequently deferred over the last 60 years. The administrative deferrals were processed through the first counsel's office in each case, documented as scheduling conflicts. Each one has a perfectly legitimate surface explanation. Marcus looked at him. How long have you known? The question was direct enough that it required an equally direct answer, and Rel gave him one. I have suspected something was wrong for approximately 30 years. I had no evidence I could act on. The Emperor did not ask questions, and I had no framework, no legitimate access, to investigate his personal medical records independently. His jaw tightened. I am his guard. I protect him from threats I can identify. I failed to identify this one. It was designed to be unidentifiable from your position, Marcus said. That's not absolution. You can carry that however you need to carry it, but it's accurate. Rel looked at him for a moment with an expression that was complicated and honest. What do you need from me now? Marcus had been thinking about this since the corridor outside the archive, building the next phase the way he built everything, from the end point backward. Identify what the final position needed to look like and working out the sequence that got there cleanly. He had the evidence. He had the treatment. He had, provisionally, 2 allies who were now fully committed to the outcome he was working toward. What he didn't have was proof of a contingency. The secondary plan. The thing that someone who thought in centuries would have built into a 60-year operation against the most powerful being in the galaxy, against the day the operation was discovered. He was fairly certain he knew what it was. He needed to confirm it, and confirming it meant doing something that went against every instinct he had about operational security. He needed to let Dreven think he was winning. I need you to do something that's going to feel wrong, Marcus said. I need you to report to Dreven that my investigation is going poorly, that I've been through the archive records and found nothing actionable, that the Emperor is declining faster than expected, and I'm running out of time. Rel was quiet for a moment. You want me to lie to the First Council. I want you to give him accurate information about an alternate version of events in which I failed. Marcus held his gaze. If he has a contingency, and he does, I'm certain of it, he'll only activate it when he believes he needs to. As long as he thinks I'm failing, he'll wait. The moment he realizes I'm succeeding, he'll move. He paused. I need him to wait until I'm ready for him to move. Another silence. Longer this time. Rel looked at the document on the table between them, then at Marcus, then at some middle distance that probably contained 8 centuries of loyalty being measured against something that had just fundamentally changed its shape. You've already identified the contingency, Rel said. It wasn't a question. I think it's embedded in the throne itself, Marcus said. The same delivery mechanism that's been administering the suppression compound for 60 years. If he activates it fully, shifts it from slow suppression to acute delivery, the Emperor's life flame goes out in hours, not months. Complete and irreversible. And from the outside, it looks like natural rapid decline. The kind that happens in the final stage. If you're wrong, I'm not wrong. He said it without arrogance. Just the flat certainty of someone who had looked at a problem from enough angles to know the shape of its answer. But I need about 18 hours to be ready. Cerebral starts the counter-treatment tonight. By tomorrow morning, the Emperor's regenerative cycle will be reinitiated strongly enough that even a full acute dose can't extinguish it. He paused. That's a window. 18 hours where Dreven thinks he's still in control, and I'm quietly making sure that when he finally moves, the move doesn't work. Rel stood. He straightened his posture in a particular way of someone who has made a decision and is now fully committed to its weight. I'll speak to Dreven within the hour, he said. Marcus nodded and stood. He was almost at the door when Rel spoke again. And this time, unlike every other time someone stopped him at a door tonight, the words were not heavy. They were simply honest. The Emperor told me something this evening, Rel said. Before you came back from the archive, he said. He paused, and for a moment the guard captain of 8 centuries looked like something much simpler and more human than his title. He said he remembered what it felt like to want tomorrow to come. Marcus stood in the doorway with that landing in his chest, in a particular way that things landed when they confirmed what you were doing was worth whatever it cost. He didn't say anything. He walked out into the corridor, toward the eastern residential tier, toward a retired physician who had stopped responding to communications, toward the last piece of evidence he needed to close the shape of a 60-year crime. Behind him, Rel picked up the document from the table and went to find the first counsel. Somewhere in the building, in a private chamber lined with 8 centuries of accumulated records and awards and the careful monuments of a long life of service, Dreven sat alone and believed everything was still going according to plan. He was about to receive confirmation of that belief. That was exactly what Marcus needed him to believe. For 18 more hours, the retired physician's name was Orvith. He lived in a modest residence in the eastern quadrant of the outer tier, modest by imperial standards, which meant it was still carved from the same ancient black stone as everything else on this world, still lit by the same amber bioluminescent fixtures that lined every corridor in the Dominion's oldest structures, still possessed ceilings high enough to accommodate a dragon's full standing height. But the space had the particular quality of somewhere that had been allowed to go quiet. No staff, no active communication terminals. The kind of silence that settled into a place not because it was peaceful, but because something had been taken out of it. Marcus knocked, waited, knocked again. The door opened on the third attempt, and Orvith stood in the frame looking like a dragon who had aged 30 years in 8 months. His scales had lost their luster. His eyes tracked Marcus with the slow wariness of someone who had been frightened for a long time and had stopped expecting the source of the fear to announce itself politely. "I'm not from the council," Marcus said immediately. "I'm not from anyone you need be afraid of. My name is Marcus Cole, and I've been in the Emperor's throne room for the last 2 days trying to figure out what's killing him." He held the retired physician's gaze steadily. "I think you already know, and I think that's why you're standing in your doorway looking like a man who expects to disappear." Orvith looked at him for a long moment. Then he stepped back and let him in. He talked for 40 minutes. Marcus listened without interrupting once. The story Orvith told was not complicated in its structure, only in its duration and its cost. 8 months ago, he had noticed the same anomalous readings that Cerebral would later flag and have cleared. Unlike Cerebral, Orvith had been senior enough to pull the complete raw diagnostic history independently, without routing his request through the administrative review system. What he found had taken him 3 weeks to fully believe, because the alternative, that someone had been doing this deliberately from inside the imperial system for 6 decades, required accepting realities so far outside the boundaries of his professional experience that his mind kept finding reasons to reject it. He had taken his findings to the one person in the imperial structure he believed had both the authority and the integrity to act on them without political filtration. He had taken them to Dreven. The first council had listened carefully, thanked him warmly, told him his findings were deeply concerning and would be investigated at the highest level, and suggested that in the interest of protecting the integrity of the investigation, Orvith should speak to no one else about what he had found. Dreven had seemed genuinely troubled, genuinely committed to action. 3 days later, Orvith had been approached by 2 members of the First Council's administrative staff and strongly encouraged to consider early retirement on health grounds. The encouragement had been gentle, thorough, and completely clear about what happened to people who declined it. His communication terminals had been restricted 1 month after that, framed as a standard security measure for retired imperial physicians with high-level clearance histories. He had spent the last 4 months in this quiet residence waiting to find out what form the final step would take. Marcus listened to all of it, and then he asked Orvith one question. "Do you still have the original data? The raw readings you pulled before you went to Dreven?" Orvith crossed his storage alcove in the far wall, removed a false panel that had been installed with the careful craftsmanship of someone who had prepared for this possibility, and handed Marcus a copper data plate that had been wrapped in a preservation sleeve and hidden behind 17 years of personal medical journals. Marcus held it for a moment. This was the original, the unaltered baseline, the evidence that the archive version had been changed because this one and that one would not match, and the divergence between them was the proof. "Can you testify to this?" Marcus asked, formally, in front of full council and the diplomatic assembly. Orvith straightened. It was a small movement, but it carried something that had been absent from his posture since Marcus arrived. something returning to a place it had been forced out of. "I am an imperial physician," he said quietly. "I have served this emperor for 140 years. Whatever I am afraid of, I am more afraid of what happens to this empire if I stay silent." Marcus tucked the data plate carefully inside his jacket. "Get some rest," he said. "Tomorrow morning, I'm going to need you in the throne room." He left the eastern residential tier and walked back to the amber-lit corridors of the throne world with the data plate against his chest and 17 hours left on his internal clock. He used 12 of them. He spent 3 with Cerebral, monitoring the first phase of the counter-treatment and watching the Emperor's readings shift in the direction of recovery with the slow, unmistakable certainty of a tide turning. Vael'Thrak slept through most of it, real sleep, deep and unguarded, the kind that a body fell into when it finally believed it was being helped rather than managed. His life flame readings by the end of those 3 hours had moved further toward normal baseline than they had in 60 years. Cerebral documented every reading with the meticulous precision of someone who understood they were creating a medical record that would be studied for centuries. He spent 4 hours with Rel, going over the contingency mechanism in the throne itself, a delivery system so elegantly integrated into the throne's existing biological interface that it had been invisible to every examination because it had been designed to look like part of the throne's original construction. Rel identified it with the thoroughness of someone who had been responsible for the physical security of that throne for 8 centuries and had just discovered how completely that responsibility had been circumvented. The expression on his face during that process was not something Marcus would ever describe to another person. Some things were private. They did not disable the mechanism. That was a critical decision, and it was Marcus's to make. Disabling it would alert whoever was monitoring it that it had been found. They left it exactly as it was and withdrew, and Marcus explained to Rel what the next morning needed to look like and what Rel's role in it was, and Rel listened with the focused attention of a soldier receiving orders from someone he had decided, without ceremony or formal acknowledgement, to trust. He spent the remaining 5 hours in the throne room, not working, not analyzing. He sat on the stone floor at the base of the Emperor's throne while Vael'Thrak slept, and he thought about the soldiers he'd carried out of places that command had already written off. And he thought about the discharge papers he'd kept in a drawer for 3 years without throwing away. And he thought about what it meant to show up for something when nobody asked you to and nothing guaranteed it would work. He thought about a dragon who had ruled for 4,000 years and had not been spoken to honestly in 200 of them. He thought about the laugh in the throne room 2 days ago, that involuntary, dark, completely unstrategic laugh that had somehow cracked something open. And he thought that sometimes the most important things a person did were the things they didn't plan. At the first morning bell, he stood up, straightened his jacket, and went to find Dreven. The first council's private chambers were in the northern tier, the oldest part of the throne world, where the stone was darkest and the history was deepest. Dreven answered his door with the composed unhurriedness of someone who had been awake for some time and had already arranged his face for the encounter. He was older than Marcus had expected. Not in appearance, dragons age differently, but in the quality of his stillness, 800 years of patience made visible. He looked at Marcus with eyes that were courteous and completely opaque. "The salvage contractor," Dreven said, "I understand your investigation has been difficult. I wanted to tell you myself," Marcus said, "before the formal session this morning, as a courtesy." He met Dreven's gaze with the expression he had practiced for 3 hours, tired, frustrated, the specific defeated quality of a man who had run out of answers and knew it. "I don't have what I need. The archive data is inconsistent. The diagnostic picture is too complex in my training, and the Emperor is declining faster than I can work." He paused. "I think the council may have been right about the timeline." Dreven was quiet for a moment that Marcus counted internally. 1, 2, 3. The quality of the silence changed on the 4th second. Barely perceptibly, but Marcus was watching for it. A minute relaxation of something that had been held carefully in place. "I am sorry," Dreven said. And the terrible thing, the thing that made Marcus's chest tighten in a way he hadn't expected, was that there was something genuine in it. Not about Marcus's failure, about the Emperor. Even now, even after everything, 800 years of genuine service lived alongside 60 years of deliberate harm in this dragon's face, and they did not cancel each other out. They coexisted, which was somehow worse. "Thank you for telling me," Dreven said. Marcus nodded and left. He walked directly to the throne room and took up a position to the left of the Emperor's platform and waited. The formal morning session assembled in stages, diplomatic delegations filing in with the shuffling ceremony of people who had been in political limbo for 2 days and were anxious for resolution. Council members taking their crescent positions behind the throne. Guard units moving to their designated stations. Rel positioned himself at the throne's lower platform. Cereval stood near the eastern entrance. Orvith, brought in through a side corridor, stood quietly near the left colonnade where a Veari diplomatic aide had once gone very still at exactly the wrong moment. The Emperor entered last. He walked to his throne under his own power, without assistance, and the room processed this in a visible ripple, a shift in posture, a collective readjustment, because Veilthrox had not walked his throne unassisted in 11 months. His scales still held gray at the edges, but there was copper underneath it now, visible and warm, like a fire that had been banked for a long time and had finally been given air. He sat and looked out at the assembled room with eyes that were present and clear and missed nothing. Dreven, in his position at the head of the High Council Crescent, saw the Emperor's eyes and went very still. Marcus watched him go still and began. He walked to the center of the room, the formal speaker's position, which he had no right to occupy and occupied anyway, and addressed the assembly without preamble or ceremony. 2 days ago I was brought into this room by accident, he said. His voice carried without effort in the chamber's acoustics. I'm an unlicensed salvage contractor with a field medic background and no political standing in any of your civilizations. I want to establish that clearly before I tell you what I found, so that nobody can argue later that I had a stake in the outcome. He paused. The Emperor's illness is not natural. It has never been natural. For 60 years, a biological suppression agent has been administered to the Emperor's throne, through the biological interface built into the throne's original construction, in quantities precisely calibrated to produce a decline indistinguishable from extreme age-related deterioration. The room did not erupt. It went the specific silence of a space in which too many beings are processing something too large for immediate reaction. Marcus continued. He walked through everything in sequence, the archived data, the altered readings, the dead physician's credentials, the 3 deferred medical reviews, Orvith's findings and subsequent retirement, the delivery mechanism and the throne itself. He presented each element in order, clearly and without drama, letting the structure of it do the work. He had learned long ago that the truth, presented plainly and in the right sequence, was more devastating than any rhetorical performance. People who tried to make the truth dramatic were usually compensating for its inadequacy. This truth needed no compensation. He placed Orvith's data plate on the floor in the center of the room and named it for what it was. The original unaltered diagnostic baseline, preserved by a physician who had found the evidence and been silenced for finding it. Then he turned and looked directly at Dreven. The administrative authorization for every element of this operation traced to one office, Marcus said. The access preservation order for the dead physician credentials, the clearances that buried Cereval's anomalous flags, the deferrals of independent medical review, the retirement pressure applied to Orvith 8 months ago. He held Dreven's gaze across the length of the throne room. All of them. One office. 800 years of access. 800 years of institutional knowledge. And 60 years of patience. He paused. First Council Dreven. The room broke. Not into chaos, into sound. The controlled, urgent sound of 27 diplomatic delegations and a full Dragon High Council simultaneously reaching the boundary of composure. Several council members were on their feet. The Veari ambassador had gone luminously pale. 3 guard units had shifted position without being ordered to, the instinct of trained security, responding to a threat before the formal command structure caught up. Dreven did not move. He stood in his position at the head of the council crescent and looked at Marcus with eyes that had dropped every layer of opacity and were simply, directly, completely present. And what was in them was not what Marcus had expected. Not calculation. Not the cold assessment of a conspirator deciding on his next move. Grief. Real, old, exhausted grief. The grief of someone who had committed entirely to a belief for 60 years and was now standing in the moment where the belief met reality and reality won. You would have let it collapse, Dreven said. His voice was quiet. The room went still enough to hear it. For 1,000 years of empire, the mercy, the diplomacy, the endless accommodation of species that would have destroyed each other without his restraint, you would have let it soften into nothing, into weakness. He looked past Marcus, at the Emperor. I served you truly for 800 years. I believed in what you built. I stopped believing in what you were allowing it to become. Vaelthrox looked at his first council for a long moment. When he spoke, his voice was very quiet and completely steady. You should have told me. You would not have listened. No, the Emperor said, but I should have had the chance to refuse. Dreven closed his eyes. When he opened them, the decision was there, visible and final, and arrived at with the same absolute commitment he had apparently applied to everything in 8 centuries of existence. He reached for the secondary control embedded in his ceremonial ring. The remote activation for contingency mechanism Marcus had left in place precisely because he'd known this moment was coming. He pressed it. Nothing happened. Marcus reached into his jacket and placed a small component on the floor beside Orvita's data plate, a piece of the delivery mechanism, the activating relay, removed from the throne 7 hours ago by Rel, who had subsequently reinstalled everything else so perfectly that a remote check would read the system as fully intact. I took it out last night, Marcus said simply. I needed you to try to use it, in front of everyone. He looked at Dreven without anger. I'm sorry, for what you lost, for the daughter he lost, for the 60 years you spent on the wrong answer to a real problem. He meant it. That was the complicated part. He genuinely meant it, but I'm not sorry for this. Dreven was taken into custody by Rel's guard unit with a dignity that Marcus suspected was the last gift 8 centuries of genuine service afforded him. The guards moved without roughness, and nobody in the room said anything that didn't need to be said. The room slowly, unevenly, found its footing again. Marcus stood in the center of it all and felt the particular exhaustion of a finished thing. Not triumphant. Not relieved exactly. Just emptied out in a way that came after sustained focus finally released its grip. He was aware of the Emperor, watching him. He walked to the base of the throne and looked up. Vaelthrox's scales in the morning light were more copper than gray for the first time in longer than most of the beings in this room had been alive. The life flame in his chest, still recovering, still fragile, was visible at the edges of his scales as a faint warm luminescence, the biological equivalent of a fire deciding, with conviction, to keep burning. The Council will want to offer you things, the Emperor said. I know. Rel already gave me the preliminary list. Marcus paused. I'd like my flight license reinstated and my ship returned without the tractor beam damage. Everything else you can keep. The Emperor regarded him for a moment. That is remarkably little. I've got salvage runs backed up. He paused. And I don't like being owed things by people with armies. Something moved across Vaelthrox's face. Slow, unfamiliar, like a muscle-remembering emotion had stopped practicing. It arrived fully a moment later. Not the shape of a laugh. Not the space where one had been. An actual laugh, deep and resonant. Filling the throne room the way the room had been built to be filled, bouncing off for kilometers of ancient stone and returning from 17 directions at once. It lasted a long time. Around the room, alien diplomats and council members and guard dragons watched an emperor laugh for the first time in 200 years and experienced the specific feeling of witnessing something they would spend the rest of their lives trying to describe accurately. When it faded, the emperor looked at Marcus with eyes that were fully, completely, irreversibly alive. Cole, he said. Yeah. What you did. There is no word for it in our language. Marcus was quiet for a moment. He thought about field hospitals and discharge papers and the particular stubbornness of refusing to accept a verdict that hadn't been earned. He thought about soldiers carried out of places everyone had already written off. He thought about a laugh in a throne room that had started all of this, unplanned, unstrategic, and apparently exactly right. In ours, he said, it's called showing up. He retrieved his jacket from the floor, nodded once at Rel, exchanged a brief look with Cerebral that contained a complete professional conversation in approximately 1 second, and walked toward the throne room exit through a corridor of 27 alien civilizations that parted for him without being asked. His ship was returned within the hour. The tractor beam damage was repaired. His flight license was reinstated with a formal imperial endorsement that would, he was later told, make him legally untouchable in approximately 60% of inhabited space. He filed a salvage run report for 3 jobs he'd missed during the 2 days, logged a maintenance complaint about the tractor beam damage for the insurance record, and lifted off in the throne world into open space as the last light of its amber interior faded behind him. He was 3 hours out when the comm activated. Private channel. No diplomatic prefix. No ceremonial identification sequence. Just a voice. Human. Marcus leaned back in his pilot seat. Emperor. The Dominion sensors are showing my life flame at 43% above baseline and climbing. The court physicians are describing it as unprecedented. A pause that carried something warm in it. Cerebral used the word miraculous. I told her it was more specific than that. What word did you use? Another pause. I told her the correct word was human. Marcus looked out at the stars for a moment. The specific, uncountable stars of the galaxy that contained 27 civilizations and 1 species that was not yet fully part of any of them, that lived at the edges of everything in salvage ships and field hospitals and wrong sector accidents, that showed up without being invited and laughed when they were frightened and refused, with irrationality bordering on biological, to accept that something was over before it was actually over. He thought that was probably a reasonable word for it. Take care of yourself, he said. Cerebral knows the treatment schedule. Follow it. I intend to. The warmth in the Emperor's voice was old and genuine and new all at once. There are things I find unexpectedly that I would like to see more of. The channel stayed open for a moment after that, neither of them filling it. The silence easy in a way that silences were easy between people who had already said the things that mattered. Then Marcus reached over and closed the comm, pointed his ship toward the first backed-up salvage run on his list, and flew into the dark between the stars. Behind him, across the Dominion, 27 civilizations received the same alert simultaneously from the Emperor's throne world. Life flame status, stable. Recovering, strong. None of them fully understood what had changed. One species did.